We're recording too. Okay, 1 second. This always happens that I lose my notes. Okay, found them. All right, so if you've just joined us on Facebook, welcome, or if you're watching the recording, welcome as well. And we're here with our audience in Zoom. So I'm very happy to be here with Amina Douidi, who is going to talk to us about anti-racism in the classroom. Where are you joining us from today, Amina?
The last time I was on a webinar, I was in the UK, in Scotland. This time I'm in Algeria, my home country. I'm in Tlemcen at the moment.
Right, okay, fantastic. So you're moving around, but you're able to join us and speak to all of our Teaching English community. That's wonderful. So we know Amina, but just to remind you, so Dr. Amina Douidi is a specialist in diversity, equity, inclusion, and intercultural communication in ELT. She works with publishers to enhance the inclusivity of their materials. She also works as an EAP teacher and as an EMI trainer. Do you want to just explain those initials, EAP?
English for academic purposes. This is the skills and skills and competencies that international students need to integrate UK universities. So I would teach over the summer, for example, pre-sessionals, academic skills, referencing skills, and all sorts of academically related competencies. And EMI stands for English as a Medium of Instruction. I started working in the context of Algeria with Algerian university lecturers who are transitioning to using English in teaching medicine, chemistry, and my focus is on pedagogy. So the same principles I studied during my PhD and I use in my teaching practice. I try to transmit them and adapt them in an EMI context.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. And I know a lot of our teachers in our Teaching English community are working in EMI context as well. So great. So just to finish off then, Amina is co-chair-elect of TESOL ICIS, advocating for contributions from teachers and researchers from the global majority. So welcome, Amina. I'm going to hand over to you and I'm here if you need me, but if not, I'll see you later for the Q&A.
I appreciate you, Joe. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen with the audience just to position our talk within the context of the Breaking Barriers mini-series. Today, I'm going to talk about anti-racism, which means that at some point we will have to talk about racism. Localizing anti-racism and what you can do in the classroom is a topic that I thought of because I noticed, especially in the global north, Europe, where I am based, I noticed that we start talking about racism only during Black History Month. And the stories that we share about racism are usually from the US. And I have a responsibility as an advocate, and also we all have a responsibility to reflect on the racism in our step in our homes, in our locality. And that's why what I'm trying to do today is invite you and call you in to reflect on how racism is constructed in your own locality and not make it a US issue or a North American issue only. So before we start talking about such an important topic, it is important to, for me at least, that we have common rules of engagement, and that I also give you heads up about certain sensitive ideas that we will discuss. So the topics that we will discuss today, they may trigger a negative reaction due to upsetting and maybe traumatic experiences. We need to know that, and I need you to know that you matter. And if these emotions, these topics trigger negative emotion, it is important for you to know to step down and to step back and maybe move away from the laptop or from the phone, and then come back when you're ready to continue this conversation. I will be using terms such as, in reference to George Floyd, for example, I will be using references to murder, and there will be terms identifying racial and ethnic groups. Nothing offensive, but I need you to be aware of that. So for ethical reasons, it is important for me to position these in a factual way. It is also important for us to prioritize educating each other with kindness. So in the chat and in the comment section, do prioritize kindness. Anti-racist education is our common responsibility, but it's a journey. It doesn't, my webinar today is not enough. So I hope that we will have the possibility to carry on this conversation later on in the comments as well, and via email maybe. So the session is designed in a way that it is supposed to be interactive, and I'm hoping that you will contribute with ideas in the chat. We will do a reflective activity, then I will establish the context, justifying why this topic matters for me and why it should matter to everyone. We will define some key concepts, and then we will have some critical incidents, scenarios of problematic situations, and I will ask you how you would deal with those, and then I will offer a solution following the framework: reflect, plan, and act. And then we would summarize and end our talk with a few takeaways on how you can localize anti-racism in your setting. So the first question I have for you is, how would you define anti-racism? I'm going to escape. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and look at the chat. I would really appreciate if you could share with me a few ideas in the chat on how you would define anti-racism. I can see that it's moving very quickly. So I can see that Stavrula is saying that anti-racism means acceptance, respect, and love. Malika is saying that it means embracing multiculturalism. Elisa also is saying that it is about raising awareness of diversity and learning how to accept and discover. Respect is a very common theme that a lot of you are sharing in the chat. Empathy as well is a very, Felicia is saying empathy, tolerance. Abigail is saying anti-racism is treating everyone the same equally, no matter the color of their skin or race. Lami Musa is saying that anti-racism is a belief or a practice. I like the focus on practice, actually, because that's what most teachers really need, that actively opposes racism and promotes racial tolerance and equality. I also like the focus on actively. I will use the term actively and proactively a lot during this webinar. Being anti-racist, Elios Ruil is saying, is being against racism in all its form, against discrimination, against bullying in the class, talking about the recognizing privilege based on race. So, for example, white privilege. Thank you, Elios. This is very, very insightful. Fernanda is saying that racism is knowing that we are mostly prejudiced and practically dealing with it, yes, concretely. So I'm going to stop now, stop here and move on to the next question that I have for you. Thank you, everyone, for all your insightful questions, answers. It just means that I will not spend a lot of time defining what anti-racism is, especially that a lot of you have shared excellent answers. So the next question I have for you is, which social category of learners experience most of the challenges at school? And by social categories, I mean which socioeconomic, race and ethnicity or gender group, is there a group that has a specific disability that experiences most challenges in your specific setting? Consider neurodiversity and nationality. So which social category of learners experience most of the challenges at school in your specific setting? I'm going to stop sharing now and coming back to the chat to read your comments. I know that a lot of you have shared the countries where you come from, where you're connecting from. So it would be relevant to see which group is minoritized in your setting. So Basma Osmani is saying that Indian Americans, Native Americans, I'm guessing Basma is saying, Native Americans are minoritized in your setting. Janice, sorry. Rob Christensen is saying that groups that are minoritized in their setting are minorities in terms of race and ethnicity. In the context of Maria Emily, it's socioeconomic groups. By socioeconomic, we basically mean groups that don't necessarily have the either financial, cultural, or economic capitals that might support them or help them. Sometimes it's even the educational capital that might support them to have socioeconomic mobility. So gender groups, Elizabeth is saying, Elios is sharing with us an example from their setting. I work in a school with a large immigrant population. I have seen racism towards students from the South American background. Yeah, sadly. Fernanda is saying that she thinks that there are religious minorities in any country, but for instance, in Italy, Muslim students may be considered minoritized or facing most advantages. Hello, Veronica. So Veronica is sharing these two groups, Moroccan and Latin American immigrants in Spain. Vanessa, there seems to be general racism against immigrants. And Justine on Facebook says that displaced pupils and definitely experience most challenges. Lami Musa is sharing non-native speakers, definitely, and plenty of interesting examples also coming from Facebook. Students who have overweight, this is a really important one, being marginalized or being minoritized or picked on or being facing a lot of challenges based on your appearance can also be taken into consideration when discussing minoritized identities. So thank you so much for these examples. I'll take a couple more. Abigail Hatrix says that those who are excluded from their peer groups because they feel different from the masses. So we see that depending on the context where you are, there will be a specific group in your classroom or in your school that will experience most challenges based on things that they cannot change. People cannot change their race and ethnicity. They cannot necessarily, especially young learners, cannot change their socioeconomic situation overnight. They cannot change their physique or appearances overnight. So those unchangeable, those identity markers become the reason why they receive either hate, discrimination, bullying from other peers. What I'm trying to do today is focus on systems of oppression rather than racism at the individual level. So we will try to look at systems of oppression and systems of racism together. So thank you for all those who are on Facebook and here on Zoom sharing their insights with us. We are going to move to the next slide now on why anti-racist education is our common responsibility. I have my notes here, which I'm going to use because I need to share with you a few personal stories. So bear with me. So I feel deeply committed and deeply responsible for the anti-racist fight. I am in my own journey of becoming or being or reinforcing my anti-racist values. As I mentioned, usually I'm based in the UK. I currently live in the UK, and my locality impacts my anti-racist education. So although I became an ethnic minority as soon as I landed in Heathrow Airport, I only began to understand truly systems of inequality by learning about the experiences of Black and ethnic minority people who have lived in the UK long before I did. So in 2018, I learned about the Windrush generation and the scandal affecting thousands born in the Commonwealth who then moved into UK, who faced losing their rights and possible deportation despite their contributions to the UK. This was never covered in my studies of UK history and culture when I was doing my bachelor's and master's in Algeria. We studied mostly the Elizabethan era with Shakespeare and all sorts of literature that I adore. However, I was really surprised that I've never heard of the Windrush generation. So we didn't study much on things about the impact of the British colonialism on post-colonial countries, such as the countries of the Commonwealth. In addition to that, during the Brexit campaign, I was also in the UK between 2016 and 2019. And I witnessed and I saw a rise in racism and hate crime. It increased significantly, primarily targeting people of the global majority. So I say people of the global majority because it is a more positive term to represent people who are historically considered minorities. So quantitatively or qualitatively, the people of the global majority have a more diverse, a more complex, a more nuanced version of their stories to tell. And if we reduce them to being minorities, then the voice is dimmed down. And if I use the term the people of the global majority, what I mean is people who are considered people of color, people who are historically and systematically minoritized by systems of oppression, oppression. So in 2020, the murder of George Floyd highlighted systemic racism in the sense that it demonstrated that it is institutional rather than just individual acts. This led to institutions, including schools, addressing racism within their systems and the rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and therefore jobs like mine. So then the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and it disproportionately impacted Black and ethnic minorities. And we saw a rise in hate crimes against people perceived as Chinese. Today, with the war in Gaza being live streamed, we also see a rise in anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish racism. So our job here is education, and education has consistently been the response to these pivotal moments in history, underscoring the importance of becoming anti-racist educators. So it is our responsibility, and we must not take it lightly. And today I am just doing one bit to contribute to that anti-racist journey that we are all on. So that's why I care about this topic, basically, because it affects me deeply, and it affects me personally, and it affects my students as well. There are a few concepts that I'd like you to help me establish. First, we're going to redefine racism to make sure that we are on the same page. Nelson and colleagues 2011 defined it as being broadly defined as a phenomenon that maintains or exacerbates avoidable and unfair inequalities in power. The concept of power is very important because those who commit acts of racism are perceived to have power over somebody else who historically or systematically doesn't. So avoidable unfair inequalities in power, resources, or opportunities across racial, ethnic, cultural, or religious groups in society. And you can see that although the term racism has the word race in it, we can also have anti-Muslim racism, which is related to a religion. We can have cultural related racism. My recommendation here or suggestion is rather, instead of saying phenomenon, which might give the impression that it is something that just happens, I want us to think about racism as a system that is organized and has been organized and built and established through colonization and empires. So I'm going to come back to the chat with you again, and would like to ask you for some lexicon and keywords and vocabulary that would come to mind when you hear the term anti-racist education. So in the chat, please type which concept come to mind when you think of anti-racist education. You can just share a few keywords. I'm going to escape from the screen again and look at the chat. Miriam Kareeb is saying history. So when we think of anti-racist education, we think of history. Definitely, thank you. Muslima, Vanessa, Marimeli are saying inclusion and inclusive and changes. Elios, privilege, power structures, colonialism and decolonialism. Stavrula is saying human rights, respect, equality, equity. I love that we are focusing on the positive, because anti-racist education is supposed to be a positive one. It's supposed to be a proactive solution to racial discrimination and equality. So love this. Felicia is saying social abilities and skills, probably Muslima. Awan is saying equality and inclusion. Hong Young is saying real examples. Yauli, respect and inclusion. Ramin Masoud is saying pro-equity. Hong Yung, again, examples of racism, yes, and bias. Ronald Hurtis, thank you. Rob, ignorance. Janice Solar, diversity. Thank you very much. We might have also some comments from Facebook on a few keywords that we could connect to the concept of anti-racist education. Yoli is saying mutual communication. Yasota, Nicola, stereotypes. Thank you so much. So I am going to share with you a few key concepts that I believe are very important if you want to develop your own anti-racist education as a teacher. And these are bystander, white supremacy, institutional racism, allyship and ally, racial literacy, and justice. Now I'm going to give you some homework to do. Your job is to develop a deep understanding of all of these individual concepts through reading and maybe articles, watching a TED Talk, or looking at some blogs, maybe academic papers. But I think lived experiences are very important. The only concepts I'm going to define for you today are these three: bystander, racial, literacy, and allyship or ally. Let's start with bystander. A person who is standing near and watching something that is happening but is not involved in it. Bystander is somebody who is witnessing a racial discrimination happening, an inequality taking place. So as a teacher, you may see something unjust, unfair happening in your setting, but you're not directly involved in it. As a teacher, you may not be the one experiencing the racial bias. However, you might also be witnessing it. So there is a new wave of research taking place at the moment about anti-racist bystanders. Basically, what it says is that we can empower bystanders by raising their awareness about racial inequality and how it looks like in their specific settings, for them to contribute to the anti-racist movement. And bystanders can be passive, but if we empower them with anti-racist education, they can become active and participate in dismantling inequalities and breaking barriers. So this is a very important question because it invites you to reflect on your own positionality. What kind of bystander are you? Are you a passive one who just witnesses what's happening, reports to other people about what's happening? Are you an active bystander who contributes to solving the racially based issue? The second concept is racial literacy, and it says, this is a paraphrase from Otto and colleagues 2023, and it is a process. So racial literacy, like any other literacy, you know it very well, dear teachers, is a process of understanding a given specific area of expertise. And racial literacy is a process of understanding how race and intersectionality work. And the concept of intersectionality is important because race can intersect with the gender, and the oppression can be doubled or harder or more difficult. So race and ethnicity and intersectionality, race can intersect with disability. So if you are minoritized as a minority racial person belonging to a minoritized racial group, in addition to having a disability, so the odds against you are even harsher. And this is what intersectionality basically tries to show. So as a process, racial literacy is is supposed to equip you with the skills and knowledge and understanding for you to take action. Understanding that race exists and as a social construct, and then racism is an outcome of that, is one level of anti-racist education. Is we are at the awareness stage. If want to do something more about beyond awareness and taking action, then you are in a journey of racial literacy, and it is your responsibility to go through this journey. Allyship is or an ally is someone who helps and supports other people who are part of a group that is treated badly or unfairly, although they are not themselves a member of this group. We in recent years we started seeing new collocations to the word ally or allyship, and one of the common collocations that we hear a lot, especially in social media, and looking at how companies support a minoritized group, the collocation became performative allyship. So when you put, for example, a black square on your Instagram account to support, to show support to Black Lives Matter movements, for example, a lot of people have commented on these very small actions as being performative and not really leading to any tangible action or change. So it is important that we define allyship in a more thorough way as an allyship that is authentic, that is rooted not in benefiting oneself or my image. I don't want to look good because I am supportive of a community and because it helps my brand. I want to do it for the right reasons. So it is important, again, to reflect on what kind of ally you are. Why do you consider yourself an ally? And what kind of sphere of influence do you have? And how much influence and action can you take? So these are my three concepts. Your job now is to define white supremacy, institutional racism, and there was something else, justice. Okay, now we're going to move to the next point, which is localizing anti-racist approaches to language education. Here, I'm going to share with you 3 scenarios. After each scenario, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and look at the chat to look at how you would deal with this situation. I'm trying to be also conscious of the time. The first incident is something that I myself observed as a researcher when I was doing my PhD research and talking to learners. So this is how it goes. Secondary school students are learning about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and they read a passage from his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." One student is very upset, but stays silent in the classroom. Later, they explained to the researcher observing the session that they were shocked that the N-word was used in the classroom without a care in the world. And this N-word was repeatedly used because this is how it is originally in the text. For historical context, Dr. Martin Luther King, who delivered his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," in 1963, makes a call for change and a call for equality between different races. And he names one race and versus another race, dreaming that both races would become brothers and siblings in the future and would have equal rights. You notice that I am not using the terms of Dr. Martin Luther King because because I don't want to trigger any negative emotion the same way the student has experienced it. So I'm going to stop sharing from my screen and come to the chat and ask you, what would an anti-racist teacher do in such situation? Here we go. So Edwin is making an exclamation comment here. Thank you. So in the chat, if your student has, if you were teaching actually, if you were teaching the speech of Dr. Martin Luther King in your classroom, how would you teach that session? For example, how would you teach the text? How can you avoid to upset the student? So Hong is saying that you may want to attend to the student and invite him or them, invite them to be calm. Benjamin is saying, are you assuming an anti-racist teacher would not use the N-word? Is that our starting point? Benjamin, I'm not necessarily assuming that the teacher does not use an N-word, but how can the teacher avoid or prevent an upsetting situation that is happening to the student where they feel that something disrespectful happened and they witnessed something disrespectful. So how can you manage this situation? Abigail, I would explain the context of the time and the background to it. Yes, very important. I agree. Certain terms become outdated. Maybe they might not have been offensive in a certain period of time, but they would not, for example, age very well and they become offensive over time. And what Abigail is explaining here is very, very useful, explaining the context of the time and the background to it as well is important. So Benjamin is saying that, let me see, is saying that the most important thing is to protect students' feelings. So if we combine Abigail's and Benjamin's comments, we do protect students' feelings, but we also explain context and history, and both can go hand in hand. Miriam is saying that an anti-racist teacher can explain beforehand the history of that era and maybe inform and alerts them to make them aware of the historical context. I love, Miriam, that you're using the word alert. I love it. We could remove the N-word. If we look at those solutions that I'm reading from the chat here, they can sit on a spectrum. We could completely remove the N-word, or we could keep it, but maybe transform it into a different word. We could also provide context to the students. Ramin is saying that an anti-racist teacher will use ethical words and would respect the culture and use nationality of Martin Luther King, and also will explain the history. Definitely. Tian is saying, I would be able to approach the issue by being assertive, not passive or aggressive. Where Edwin Lay brings up the N-word and you're just responding to the N-word is extremely racist and has a racist history. Definitely. Fernanda, before anything disrespectful happens, set the tone of the classroom and make it very clear. I love that you use capital letters, Fernanda, and make it very clear what is acceptable and what is not, but be flexible as well. I can see your teaching approach here. I can see you. Explain the context, focus on the message. He took the power of hate away from others, Rob is saying. That's what Dr. Martin Luther King is. Yes, sometimes when a minoritized community has been addressed by pejorative terms, terms that have been used to insult them, sometimes this community takes over that word and takes the power over and reaffirms and makes appropriates that term and uses them in a positive light. And this is also a way of resisting oppression. So taking a negative term that was used by a group against you and make it yours and claim it back is a very, very powerful way to resist oppression. So I guess that's what was happening at the time, but the N-word used by Martin Luther King was a replacement to another term that was much more offensive at the time. But now we are moved on. We are in 2024, so it is important for us to adapt the words of and make them relevant to our students without missing on explaining the context. So Benjamin Roden is saying there is another layer when teaching students whose first language is not English. It is impossible to explain the power of that word now has in our language. I love this perspective on first and second and third languages because I don't have an emotional connection to certain words in English because they don't concern me. So in the case of this student in particular, they were very interested in US culture. They loved watching US American movies, and they loved listening to rap music, and they were aware of how offensive that word was. And what happened is that they could not understand why the teacher didn't see the gravity and the gravity in using that term over and over in the text, because this is the setting, the situation. It is a reading text. It is in the textbook. The textbook has been published by the ministry, and the teacher is asking students to read aloud from the text. So over and over, the text is being read without any filter, without any criticality. And that's what was really upsetting to the student. How come their teacher was not aware of the gravity of using that term? I will definitely come back to the chat later on and ask Joe and Melissa to share with me your comments. But I would like to move to the next scenario. I'm conscious of the time. So thank you all for engaging with this activity. The next scenario is here. So the class is discussing the conditional, and the theme is which charitable actions they would undertake if they had the money and the resources. One student says that they would travel to Africa and build schools for orphaned children. My question to you, is this problematic? What would an anti-racist teacher do? So I'm going to leave this for a few more seconds for you to read again and look at the chat for comments of what would an anti-racist teacher do. Thank you, Joe. Okay, so I can see one comment, Benjamin is saying, why Africa? So exactly. Africa has been historically, especially in the ELT context, has been represented in a needy light, needing of charity. So it is very problematic that they focus on going to Africa and building schools. This example is actually an adaptation to another situation that I was not at liberty to share, where the student, so I'm going to stay very vague, where the students suggested that they would adopt children, orphans from Africa, and they would and they used really, really negative terms, racist terms per se. So we will see later on what would the teacher do. The next scenario, for this one, I'm not going to look at the chat, but please feel free to write your ideas in the chat. I will look at them later on. So for this one, student comes in late, clearly upset. Teacher asks to speak to the student. After class, they tell her, I was stopped by a group of young men who wanted to sell me something. I avoided them and they started to shout swear words at me, really bad words. They said racist slur. I think I was discriminated. And this was a student of Chinese nationality who experienced this racial profiling and aggression, and they said I was discriminated. So I'm going to share with you a few ways you could approach those three scenarios. The framework I'm going to use is from How to Build Your Anti-Racist Classroom by Orline Badu, 2023. And she uses this reflect, plan, act cycle. Sometimes you start by planning and then reflect again and act. Sometimes you act, then reflect and plan and act again. So I'm using this diagram to illustrate how this process is not linear and it should be iterative. For the context of the text of Dr. Martin Luther King, there are three things we could do. Reflect, first realize that institutional bias, again, this is not just the teacher being unaware or lacking anti-racist education. It is a whole institution that made this incident happen. So the curriculum designers have not taken this into consideration. The teacher training did not include anti-racist awareness raising. The textbook did not include a section or a teacher note that says that we need to take into consideration sensitivity and provide historical context. So there is an institutional issue, a systemic issue here. Then we can plan, we can provide historical context, just like you shared, for problematic terms and offer alternative terms. We could change the N-word with terms such as Black people, Black individuals, African American individuals, instead of the term that was used. It was definitely accepted in the past, but not anymore. And then we can act. If the student didn't feel safe to tell the teacher that that was a problem and they didn't necessarily have a language to express that, then it is the responsibility of the teacher to co-create with their learners a classroom of culture where your students can feel safe to challenge problematic approaches. They should feel empowered to say, no, we cannot say this, especially that they have more exposure to media now. They have maybe more than us. We could also use trigger warnings, and this refers to the alert term that was used in the chat. So trigger warnings, similarly to the one I used at the beginning of this session, are definitely a good practice. We provide definitions, context when introducing problematic language. For the second scenario, which is about considering Africa as a place that needs charity, we need to reflect, plan, and act. We can blame the students for using racist language, or maybe thinking about them as being exposed to racist racist discourse in their homes. However, I would think and reflect, where is the institutional bias? Are the students aware of the colonial history, of how charities are portrayed in the media? If they go into shops, are there posters with children, Black children needing food or in famine all the time wherever they go? So consider these big picture kind of institutional biases and systemic biases. Then plan, provide historical context for problematic ideology, and offer alternatives such as local charity for work. So why would you go to Africa when there are a lot of issues that you can solve just close in your neighborhood? ACT, you can have a classroom project where you help your students identify how minoritized identities are represented in the school books and library. Bring all the books that you have in your school, put them in the middle of the classroom, ask them to look page by page and use the board, the whiteboard or the blackboard, what kind of board you have, and make a table, count how many people are represented, which nationality, which race and ethnicity, which gender, which ability and disability, how are they represented, and make the students see what they read and analyze what they're reading. You can also invite them to do a discovery project, to take note of all posters, adverts they see on their way to school. How are people represented? Who is represented and how? As for the third incident where the student was basically racially abused. Institutional bias, again, provide context about the COVID pandemic and educate, but you need to empower your racialized students, those who experience those aggressions with language. They need to be able to speak about their oppression and to articulate their feelings. So small class discussions, safeguarding well-being slides to your PowerPoint, have a list of where they can go to report any incidents that happen to them, regularly check on them, make your school intervene, especially your school directors. This is very important, that the anti-racist journey should be a collective one. Which brings us to the summary of our anti-racist approaches. Get the buy-in of your school and leaders and colleagues. Don't do it alone. Whole school anti-racist approaches take time and are more sustainable. You could have a conversation with their parents. You could change one word from your book, but it doesn't change the system. That's why you need institutions behind you. Honor contributions of Black and global majority scientists, thinkers, sports people, artists, but also acknowledge systemic barriers when relevant. Empower with language. Naming the painful, the harmful is very important for your students. It can be also very empowering for them. Involve your students in analyzing the books they read, the cartoons they watch, and the adverts they see. I invite you to look at the British Council webinar by Amanda Hawthorne. It is in the handouts. These are my references. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amina, and that was super, super interesting. And can I just thank you as well for asking such interesting questions? The quality of the conversation in the chat has been really, really high. So interesting to talk about these things, and they're difficult issues as well, to know always what to do in the classroom, how to respond, how to change people's minds, and so on. So I think I'm going to go immediately to this question from Elias, which is a brilliant question. Let's see, we've got 1 minute before we need to finish, but let's try to answer. So Elias says, we can see by the results of the European elections that xenophobia and racism is increasing rather than decreasing, especially amongst younger voters, despite anti-racist education. How can educators confront a backlash amongst teenage learners who are more often watching racist and far-right content on social media? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Such a difficult question, because we put the responsibility of the society of fixing the society on the teacher, on one teacher alone in their own classroom, while they have to teach grammar lessons as well. So it's very tricky to answer this one. However, as I suggested in my presentation today, it has to be long-term anti-racist pedagogy throughout the whole year. The values need to be on the walls at the beginning of the session, at the beginning of the year, during break, during holidays. It has to be integrated in the educational journey from the beginning, and you can't do it alone as a teacher. You can have You can inspire, but you can't really do much if you don't have the buy-in of your institution.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And I like the point you made about having the rules on the walls, or having policy, you know, when you've got policies or you've established rules around respect in your class, then if someone challenges that and it comes up, you refer them back to what we've already agreed, right? So it's not like you have to deal with it on the spot always.
It's a difficult one because you don't want to punish before educating.
Yeah,
So the experiences of colleagues have been that they were teaching their casual grammar lesson and then something racist comes up. What do I do? Do I punish? Do I educate?
yeah,
My answer is you should have educated way before the
right.
year started. That's my long-term solution. But then when you are faced with this immediate, when you freeze and you don't know what to do, that's when you know that the solution is not instant. The solution has to be long-term.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So important things to bear in mind, not to feel too much response. You know, it's horrible when you feel like I don't know what to do, or I didn't deal with that badly. I dealt with that badly, but you know, you can always come back to the issue or think about how to prevent the issue in future. Okay. Well, unfortunately, that is all we have time for. Thank you so much to everybody. Thanks to Wayam, who is moderating in Facebook. Thanks to Anne, also moderating here in Zoom, and Amina. A pleasure as always. Thanks so much. So all the links we've shared in the chat, I will also send to you by email. Don't worry if you missed anything. And we'll see you all after a short 15-minute break for our last session today, which is a panel discussion with lots of practical classroom ideas on breaking down barriers. So see you all shortly.